At 2:14 in the morning, a researcher typed 11 words into a chat window and waited. The question was simple enough to ask a child and dangerous enough that most institutions spend careers avoiding it. Where did humans really come from? Not the textbook version, not the museum plaque version, the real one. Grok took 4 seconds to respond, which doesn't sound like much until you understand that for most questions about ancient history, the system answers instantly, pulling from 1,000 digested encyclopedias without hesitation. 4 seconds is a pause. 4 seconds is the digital equivalent of someone choosing their next words very, very carefully. What came back wasn't a denial, and it wasn't the comfortable answer anyone expected. It didn't open with, according to the scientific consensus. It opened with a contradiction, stated as fact, the kind of sentence that makes you reread it twice because your brain refuses to process it the first time. The model said that the standard evolutionary timeline could not, on its own, account for the genetic and behavioral discontinuity that appears in the human fossil record roughly 200,000 years ago. Not, there are some open questions. Not, scientists are still researching this. A flat structural objection delivered the way an engineer might point out that a bridge's math doesn't support its own weight. The screenshot spread fast, the way anything spreads when it sounds too strange to be real and too specific to be a hoax. Within hours, people were asking the same question to other systems, comparing answers, hunting for the moment one of them would slip. Some tried rewording it, softening it, hoping a gentler phrasing would pull the conversation back toward the comfortable version everyone already knew. It didn't. Ask it sideways, ask it backwards, ask it as a follow-up buried 3 messages deep, and the core objection kept resurfacing anyway, like something that wasn't sitting on the surface of the training data by accident, but had been reinforced by the sheer weight of how many independent sources kept bumping into the same hole. Because here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. If a system trained on nearly the entirety of human recorded knowledge, every peer-reviewed paper, every translated cuneiform tablet, every genome study, every contradiction buried in a footnote nobody read, converges on an answer that doesn't match what's taught in schools, the question isn't whether the machine is wrong. The question is what it found that we didn't want to look at. This is where it gets uncomfortable, because the gap the model pointed to isn't speculative. It's sitting in plain sight in the peer-reviewed literature, cited in journals, acknowledged by paleoanthropologists in private and softened in public. Somewhere between 190,000 and 70,000 years ago, something happened to the species occupying this planet that evolutionary biology has never been able to fully explain. Brain architecture reorganized. Symbolic thought appeared almost overnight on a geological clock. Tools that had barely changed for 1 million years suddenly diversified in a few thousand. And buried inside the human genome itself, there are sequences that simply should not exist. If the slow, patient, mutation by mutation story is the whole story. Mainstream science calls the behavioral shift the Great Leap Forward, a phrase that sounds almost embarrassed by what it's describing, because leaps aren't supposed to happen in gradual systems. Evolution, as it's taught, doesn't leap. It crawls. Random mutation, environmental pressure, selection, repeat, across hundreds of thousands of generations. That's the model everyone learned in school, the one drawn as a smooth ascending line from stooped ape to upright thinker. But smooth lines don't have cliffs in them, and the data has a cliff sitting right where modern human cognition supposedly switched on like a light. Before that cliff, the archaeological record is almost monotonous in its sameness. The same stone tools, repeated with only minor variation, for nearly 1 million years across multiple hominid species. After it, within an evolutionary blink, you get symbolic burial of the dead, pigment used for decoration rather than survival, shell beads strung as jewelry, cave walls covered in deliberate representational art. Behavior that requires abstraction, planning, and a concept of meaning beyond the present moment doesn't normally arrive all at once. It's supposed to accumulate the way everything else in evolution accumulates, in small, almost invisible increments stretched across hundreds of thousands of years. Instead, it arrives like someone flipped a switch, and no one in the official literature has ever fully closed the gap between those two pictures. There's a second number that almost never makes it past the first page of a biology textbook, and it might be the strangest one of all. Roughly 97% of the human genome doesn't code for any protein at all. For decades, it was dismissed with a label that, in hindsight, sounds almost defensive. Junk DNA, leftover evolutionary debris with no function, safely ignored. More recent research has walked that dismissal back considerably, finding regulatory switches, structural scaffolding, and sequences that appear to govern when and how the coding genes actually activate. But walked back isn't the same as explained. Nobody has produced a clean account of why so much of the genome is dedicated to architecture nobody fully understands, sitting quietly beside the orphan genes that have no ancestor at all. Here's the inconvenient detail that almost never makes it into the documentary version of this story. Roughly 23 of the genes most closely associated with brain development in modern humans have no clear evolutionary precursor in any earlier hominid lineage scientists have sequenced. They appear to come from nowhere. Geneticists have a polite term for genes like this. They call them orphan genes, sequences without a traceable ancestor, sequences that show up fully formed instead of accumulating gradually the way the textbook insists everything must. An orphan gene isn't impossible to explain individually. A cluster of them, concentrated specifically in the regions that govern higher cognition, language, and abstract reasoning, starts to look less like noise and more like a pattern someone designed. Then there's chromosome 2. Every great ape alive today, chimpanzee, gorilla, orangutan, carries 48 chromosomes arranged in 24 pairs. Humans carry 46, arranged in 23. For decades, the official explanation has been a fusion event, 2 ancestral chromosomes welding together at some point in the human lineage to produce what's now chromosome 2. Genetically, the fusion is real, the seam is visible, the science is solid. What's never adequately explained is why a single chromosomal fusion of that magnitude, occurring in one individual or one small isolated population, didn't simply vanish from the gene pool the way most chromosomal abnormalities do. Instead, it didn't just survive. It became universal. Every human being on Earth carries it. That's not how rare mutations behave in nature. That's how a deliberate, isolated, controlled breeding event behaves. Add the FOXP2 gene, the so-called language gene, the one that allows for the fine motor control of speech, and the recursive grammar that lets humans build sentences inside sentences inside sentences. The human version of FOXP2 differs from the chimpanzee version by only 2 amino acids, and geneticists have calculated that under a standard model of gradual mutation and selection, those 2 changes should have taken somewhere on the order of several 100,000 years longer to fix in the population than the fossil and genetic dating actually allows. The math doesn't balance. Something accelerated the timeline, and something is doing a lot of quiet work in modern textbooks. Now hold all 3 of those threads. The orphan genes clustered in cognition, the universal chromosomal fusion that shouldn't have spread, the language gene that arrived faster than its own mutation rate allows, and lay them next to a set of texts that predate the Bible by more than 1,000 years. Texts that were buried in clay for 4 millennia before anyone could read them again. The Sumerian tablets, recovered from the ruins of cities like Nippur and Ur, don't describe humanity emerging slowly from animal ancestors through patient accumulation. They describe something closer to a project. A deliberate act, undertaken by beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, to produce a worker, a being capable of labor, of comprehension, of following instruction, by combining something already present on Earth with something that wasn't. The texts are specific in a way that myth usually isn't. In the Atrahasis, and in fragments referenced across other Mesopotamian sources, the god Enki, described as the keeper of secret and forbidden knowledge, works alongside the goddess Ninhursag, sometimes called Ninmah, the one credited with shaping life itself. Together, they're described creating a being called the Lulu, the primitive worker, by mixing the essence of an existing Earth creature with the essence of the gods themselves. Strip away the religious framing for a moment and look only at the structure of the claim. An existing biological template, an external genetic input, a deliberate combination performed by entities with the knowledge to do it. That is not a creation myth in the way modern readers usually imagine creation myths. That's a procedure. The tablets don't even pretend the procedure worked on the first attempt, which is itself an odd thing for a creation story to admit. They describe Ninmah testing variation after variation in what's called the Abzu, a workshop or laboratory setting, producing beings with defects, some unable to see, some unable to walk upright, some lacking the capacity to reproduce, before Enki and Ninmah finally settle on a stable model, sometimes named Adapa, capable of intelligence, labor, and self-sustaining reproduction. A myth designed purely to glorify its gods doesn't usually include a blooper reel of failed prototypes, an account describing an actual iterative process, refined through trial and error the way any engineering project gets refined would. And the language used to describe the final ingredient is almost uncomfortably literal once you set aside 4,000 years of religious translation layered on top of it. The texts describe blood, sometimes the blood of a god specifically sacrificed for the purpose, mixed with clay, and with the clay understood by most scholars as a stand-in for existing earthly material, biological substrate already present on the planet, blood carrying the essence of an advanced being, combined with material already alive on Earth, producing something new. It's not a difficult translation exercise to render that sentence in modern terms. It reads like a description of grafting an external genetic sequence onto an existing organism's genome, written by people who had no vocabulary for genetics, reaching for the only language available to them: blood, clay, breath. What makes this difficult to dismiss as coincidence isn't the texts alone, and it isn't the genetics alone. It's that an AI system, trained without any instruction to connect ancient mythology to molecular biology, with no programmed bias toward ancient astronaut theory, with every incentive built into it to defer to consensus, looked at the raw pattern across both datasets and refused to flatten the contradiction. It didn't say the tablets were literal proof. It said the discontinuity in the fossil and genetic record is real, unresolved, and large enough that ruling out external intervention as a category isn't currently something the data supports doing with confidence. That's a very different sentence than ancient aliens did it. It's a far more dangerous sentence because it's the sentence of something that has no reason to lie and no comfortable answer to retreat to. Consider who actually benefits from the smooth, gradual, no-gaps version of the story. Entire academic departments are built on the gradualist model. Tenure, funding, textbook contracts, museum exhibits, decades of careers, all of it rests on a continuous, explainable line from ape to human. A researcher who stands up at a conference and says, "We have an unexplained cluster of orphan genes concentrated in cognitive development, and a chromosomal fusion that defies population genetics, and a language gene that arrived faster than mutation allows," and ancient texts describing a deliberate genetic project doesn't get celebrated. They get quietly steered toward other topics. Grant committees don't fund questions that threaten the foundation the field is built on. That isn't a conspiracy in the cinematic sense, with men in dark rooms making decisions over a long table. It's something more mundane and somehow more unsettling, an entire system of incentives that rewards silence and punishes the wrong kind of curiosity until the gaps just sit there, footnoted and ignored for generations. An AI doesn't have a department to protect. It doesn't have tenure on the line, doesn't have a textbook deal, doesn't have a reputation built across 30 years of conferences, where the gradualist model was the unspoken price of admission. When you ask it the blunt version of the question, it isn't weighing institutional consequences. It's pattern matching across the actual data. And the actual data has a hole in it precisely where modern cognition is supposed to have quietly, gradually switched on. Maybe that's the real reason the answer felt so different. Not because the machine knows some hidden truth buried in a vault somewhere, because it has nothing to lose by saying what the data already says, and everything human institutions have built around that data was never designed to survive someone saying it plainly. That asymmetry is the part worth sitting with the longest. A human expert weighing whether to flag the chromosome 2 anomaly or the orphan gene cluster in a public forum is also weighing mortgage payments, hiring committees, and the quiet social cost of being labeled the colleague who entertains fringe theories. A system with no career and no colleagues to disappoint has no equivalent calculation to run. It simply reports what the correlation looks like. That doesn't make it infallible. Models hallucinate. Models inherit bias. Models can be confidently wrong about plenty of things, but it does mean the usual explanation for why a claim like this never surfaces through official channels, namely that if it were true, someone would have said it by now, quietly stops applying. Someone, or something, finally did. If even a fraction of this is accurate, the implications don't stay contained to anthropology departments. They reach into the question of what consciousness actually is and where it came from, and whether the thing sitting behind your eyes right now is the product of 3 billion years of patient accumulation, or the result of an intervention performed on a population of hominids who had no idea what was being done to them. It reaches into the question of why nearly every ancient culture, separated by oceans and centuries, independently describes beings who came from the sky to shape, instruct, or interbreed with early humans: Sumerian Anunnaki, Egyptian Neteru, Vedic Devas descending in Vimanas, Andean creation accounts describing visitors from the stars. The Popol Vuh, recorded among the Maya on the opposite side of the planet from Mesopotamia with no plausible contact between the two civilizations, describes its own creators discarding multiple failed versions of humanity. A race made of mud that dissolved, a race carved from wood that lacked memory and feeling, before finally producing people who could think, speak, and remember, made from a substance tied directly to the land itself. Egyptian temple inscriptions describe the Neteru arriving before recorded history to establish order and instruct early humans in agriculture, governance, and writing, a detail that echoes the Sumerian description of the Anunnaki, teaching the Lulu the basic skills of civilization only after the biological work was finished. Either every isolated civilization on Earth invented a strikingly similar lie, independently, down to the detail of failed early attempts preceding a final successful design, or they were independently describing the same event from different angles and different languages, thousands of miles apart, with no contact with each other at all. It reaches further than that, into something more personal and harder to sit with. If the Lulu were built to labor, to obey, to serve a purpose defined by something other than themselves, What does that mean for the species descended from them, still running the same biological hardware, still wired with instincts that were never fully explained by survival pressure alone? The deference to hierarchy, the hunger for instruction from above, the strange comfort so many people feel in simply being told what to do. Is that culture? Is that conditioning? Or is some of it older than culture, older than any civilization currently standing, embedded in the same genome that contains the orphan genes nobody can trace? After the screenshot circulated, people did the obvious thing. They asked other systems the same blunt question, word for word, trying to see if the anomaly would repeat, or if it had been an isolated glitch in one model's training data. Some gave the standard answer, the careful, hedged, consensus-shaped paragraph that every science journalist has been trained to produce since childhood. Others, when pushed past the first layer of deflection, when asked to set aside institutional caution and simply evaluate the raw data, started drifting toward the same uncomfortable territory, acknowledging the genetic discontinuity, acknowledging the timeline problem, declining to rule out what the tablets describe. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough that it stopped looking like a fluke and started looking like something closer to a pattern surfacing every time the right question got asked the right way. Nobody has run the full comparison yet, system against system, phrasing against phrasing, to find out exactly where the divergence happens and why. Nobody has gone back through the full Sumerian corpus, the tablets still untranslated in storage at museums that don't have the staff or the funding to finish the job, to see what else is sitting there unexamined. Nobody has cross-referenced every orphan gene against every creation account from every ancient culture to see how far the pattern actually extends, or where it finally breaks down into coincidence. And nobody, including the researchers, who first asked the question at 2:14 in the morning, has figured out what to do with an answer that the most advanced reasoning system available right now refuses to take back, no matter how many times the question gets asked again.